Welcome everyone to the Universal Performance Assessment Metric, a new approach to NAPL remedy strategies. Your conference is hosted by Scott Hartzell. My name is Stephanie and I'm your event manager. During the presentation, your lines will remain on listen only. If you require assistance at any time, please key *0 on your telephone and a coordinator will be happy to assist you. You may submit web questions throughout the presentation by clicking on the Q&A tab. Type in your question and send to all panelists. These will be addressed in your Q&A session. I would like to advise all parties this conference is being recorded, and now I'd like to hand your conference over to Scott. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you all with us. I am Scott Hartzell, your host for today's presentation. The presentation is going to cover a new approach to dealing with NAPL remedy strategies, and specifically to a universal performance assessment metric. Our presenters, Rangamuthu and Saroj Kandel. I do want to mention that today's presentation has been approved for PDH hours, so if you are in need of such, please just send me an email, respond to the email here, and we will get you a sign-in form and get you a certificate processed. Next slide. A few housekeeping reminders. As you heard, all your lines are on mute. No one really needed to hear the dog barking in the background, so we'll cut down some background. And we do have the Q&A section of the WebEx open, so you can submit your questions. We will go through those at the end of the presentation. And we would ask at that point that you would mention your name and your location in case we do need to follow up and get back with you with a more detailed answer than what we can provide on the presentation today. Brief agenda of what you will see in here today and the Q&A section at the end. Our guest speakers today, Rangamuthu is a subject matter expert with Parsons on LNAPL, 13 years of experience in assessment management of NAPL, and a lot of work on site model development, modeling, and new tools and techniques, risk assessment, and corrective actions. He manages one of our larger O&M projects in the area at the Whiting, Indiana. He works with Saroj Kandel, who is a civil and environmental engineer with 4 years of experience concentrating in stormwater management, fluvial hydraulics, contaminant flow, and hydraulic and hydrologic structure design. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ranga for a core value moment.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to really appreciate and thanks for taking time for being present for this topic, which I hope is useful and interesting and innovative, which kind of goes into my core value that I'm going to be talking about, which is innovation. So, Wikipedia defines innovation as something like carrying out a new combination of, whether it's new goods, production, new markets, supply, whatnot. But essentially, what it is it's an idea that can transform into reality. See, for a person or an organization to be successful, right, so there was a recent interesting article in the Harvard Business Review. So they kind of identify 5 key factors, but essentially these kind of fall under 2 buckets. One is the people, the other one is the process, right? So when you're talking about people, it's a pyramid approach. So we want to make sure that employees are challenged enough to be innovators. We have leaders and upper management who are facilitating the process, allowing people to be innovative. And on the procedural side, we want to make sure that innovation is kind of being, incentivized, right? So we want to define what innovation means for your company or your process. How do you quantify it? And, how do we make it friendly for people? So it can be incremental. It doesn't have to be a huge, out there approach. Which is kind of what we're dealing today as far as the topic itself is concerned. So with that being said, I would like to quickly give a general outline on what we're going to be talking about today. First off, we're going to talk about why do we need a risk metric when perhaps there is quite a few ways to skin the cat, if you will, and why is this metric any different than others, and what can it tell us? How do we use it and what did we learn? So we're going to be presenting a proof of concept, a case study for a site where we are actually piloting this. and what are the things that we learned and what are the things that we did do better. And finally, hopefully, at the end of this presentation, we are hoping that there are some pretty useful takeaways for your site. And that's when we will also have time for question and answers. Okay, so at the outset, if we take a step back, right, so why do we need a risk metric, right? So there are some challenges. So I'm going to be kind of exclusively talking about hydrocarbon, meaning NAPL impacted sites. They may have multiple versions of remedies where, for example, pump and treat systems, they may have physical barriers, or, they may even have enhanced biodegradation, for example, right? But there are two broad things that seem to be quite common in these sites is the incoherent approaches to remedy effectiveness and risk. What it means is that we have very good metrics, defined metrics to kind of monitor the remedy effectiveness. But the implication on the risk, meaning how do they mitigate the risk, the receptor impacts, are not quite coherent enough. So, for example, if we have a perimeter system, we are recovering fluids, there's a perceived risk that if we turn off the system, things are going to migrate right away, and then we're going to end up with some big issue, right, with potentially failing, from an environmental risk point of view. So that's one thing. The second thing is there's no integrated approach, meaning like there is increased recognition that natural losses, we're talking about M&A or monitored natural attenuation or natural source zone depletion, are important mechanisms. There is increasing data and evidence to suggest that's the case, and especially for legacy sites, these are mechanisms that can pretty much take over the site in mitigating the risk. So there's a lack of integrated approach. There's more focus on anthropogenic, meaning man-made or human-induced remedies, versus what are the natural processes doing in terms of managing or mitigating the risk we have. So therefore, it all boils down to this, right? So we are looking at plume migration versus plume depletion, and is there a way to normalize that approach? Like, it's just not, we don't want to operate in a vacuum wherein we are looking at plume migration metrics and say, okay, my system is effective and that's it. Whereas if we don't understand what the depletion characteristics of the plume is, right, then we don't have a good understanding of the true measure of the risk. So that's where this UPAM, or the Universal Performance Assessment Metrics, are concerned. So conceptually speaking, you're looking at a body of, a body here, and, you're looking at a mechanism that body is migrating, the arrow, in the direction of the arrow shown here, and, the plume migration is what we're looking at. The depletion is basically natural losses, sorption, and those kinds of factors that are mitigating the plume in terms of its migration itself, and also mitigating the risk, because when you're talking about components like benzene, toluene, those are the risk drivers, right, predominantly at these sites. So the UPAM is essentially a way to kind of normalize the risk associated with those two. All right, what is UPAM? It is very simple. It's a distance metric, and essentially what it tells you is that it's the potential distance a contaminant can migrate at a given time, accounting for the different migration and the depletion processes, or the metrics. It can provide an effective remedial action objective framework wherein you're able to look at how effective my current system is it going to truly mitigate the risk under all conditions. That would allow us to determine whether the existing remedy can be optimized or whether we need a newer solution. It's a scalable tool. We have kind of used this in both Excel and R environment. It's an easily scalable tool, so that would allow us to make it really an agnostic tool. And the fact is, it's a simple distance metric. It allows us to visually understand what it means in terms of the risk. Okay, so this concept doesn't seem to be, brand new, right? Is it innovative enough? But it's not. But the way we are looking at it is innovative, because it will actually tell you how long and how much time we have before it migrates. So before I have impacts to the receptor. Is my existing remedy effective at all under all scenarios, possible scenarios? And last but not the least, when we're talking about existing systems, legacy systems, right, we are in this endless motions of OM&M, right, maintenance, optimization, monitoring. But what this metric also allows us to do is to make very strategic and informed decisions as to what it means in terms of your OM&M efforts. So once we know that if I turn off a system, for example, what is the biggest risk that I have and how long I have, that allows you to determine what kind of maintenance we need, or even schedule maintenance during those times. Perhaps when you have low groundwater level conditions, maybe the perceived risk is significantly lower. So that's when you may want to do some maintenance work. You're able to optimize your remedy because, depending on the scenarios, you don't need to pump as aggressively as you need to be, which, ties into the next aspect, which is the financial metric, the tangible and the intangible cost savings, meaning you don't need to pump a whole lot of fluids. You are therefore reducing the amount of volume you're either treating or disposing. There is a net savings in the amount of energy that's consumed. There is perhaps even a labor cost that you can save associated with this. The safety and the implementability are a little bit more intangible metrics in the sense that, perhaps you're spending more time in looking at a perimeter system, but if your risk is not as bad as you think it is based on this evaluation, you don't need to spend a lot of time. So you're therefore reducing the exposure associated with, maintaining or, operations and optimization of these systems. So I'm going to quickly transfer it to my colleague, Suraj Kandal, who's going to kind of actually go through the details of how this metric is estimated, basically kind of go under the hood. And he's going to also start out with a case study to explain how we are using this metric and how we are interpreting the results. Suraj?
Thank you, Ranga. So now, as we know, what you can use. So I'm going to briefly talk about the math or the equations that we use when we are developing this tool. So here you can see a classic groundwater freight and transport equation, including decay and absorption TOM. So here you can see on the left-hand side, there's the retardation coefficient, concentration depending on time. And on the right-hand side, you can see the concentration with the force distance, linear velocity, and the end TOM, that is reaction axis, is the rate of generation or destruction of the species due to chemical or biodegradation or biological degradation. And also we kind of look Ogata Bank's simplified equation coded in R to generate instantaneous output of concentration versus distance for various time frame and concentration versus time for various distance. So I'm going to briefly talk about the NAPL phase scenarios that we kind of use to develop this tool, or the analytical solutions or different approaches we used when we were trying to develop this tool. So based on Mahler paper, that is Nicholas Mahler from Colorado State University. So based on his proof of concept experiment, he proposed analytical solution to estimate the NAPL length, that is NAPL extent time, as a function of time, and also a volumetric NAPL flux as a function of position, based on the different site conditions. So 3 NAPL body or the 3 NAPL geometries were considered that are representative of field condition. So here you can see the number 1 or A is linear 1D NAPL geometry, B is circular NAPL geometry, and D is oblong NAPL geometry. So I'm not going to discuss more into detail regarding all these geometries and how we calculated the NAPL plume length and NAPL flux, which we'll be discussing detail in our NAPL evaluation later on. But I'm going to briefly talk about under which conditions these 3 geometries are valid. So for linear NAPL body, as mentioned here, this linear NAPL body or 1D NAPL body is consistent with uniform NAPL flow condition. So the circular geometry, this kind of scenarios could be consistent with near source condition or flat water table, and oblong geometry is kind of consistent or applicable where you have a regional water table is relevant. So in this case study, based on our site, oblong geometry was more appropriate. So we use both linear and oblong geometry to evaluate the plume length and NAPL flux. So these are the equations based on the Mahler paper we use to evaluate the plume length for different NAPL geometries. So now, since we know the math behind this tool, I'm going to briefly talk about okay, now how are we going to use this tool, or how are we using this tool? So this, as Ranga previously mentioned, that we are currently doing a case study in one of our client sites. So this tool is used in our client site. The client site is kind of a legacy site where there is an impact of like hydrocarbon and NAPL three-phase, and that the system is, or the site is pretty close to the surface water body. The overall site has multiple like remediation systems, that is like multiple like pump and treat systems with other like remediation systems too. And the hydrogeological condition in the site is kind of influenced by surface water body, since the system that where we did since the location where we did the case study is a perimeter system, that is a conventional like pump and treat system. And in terms of like tools, like we are using Power BI as a front end to show the visual maps of rigs to receptor like migration, and also we are using Excel and R to kind of like generate outputs. So now I'm going to focus more into the case study and site itself. So this tool is we are using as a proof of concept right now. So here you can see like the topmost figure is the perimeter system or the current like field study location. So this is kind of like a conventional like pump and treat system. Here you can see the red line. That is like they have like multiple well point systems for extraction. That is kind of like pretty similar to the pump and treat system. And there is also a slurry wall as a second line of defense to stop the migration. So if you see like as a conceptual model, here, what we are trying to show here is that like when these pump and treat system are like in operation, you can see the inward gradient. That is like the dissolve phase and NAPL phase are being contained within the system. And when there is a loss of control, that is like when the system is down, then we can see there is outward gradient. So the use of this tool is basically to evaluate the rigs when the system is off. And this kind of system is a legacy system, as mentioned previously. Like it has been operating since 30 years. So it was installed in 1990. Since then, we have done like multiple iterations or changes in design in terms of like different like well point like design in order to optimize the system and see like how effective this pump and treat system is in order to stop the NAPL migration. Since the system is a perimeter system that is nearby the surface body, is always a risk of migration of NAPL and dissolve phase. And also like there are like a lot of like utilities, since it is a legacy site, so there is always a potential of like a preferential pathway, so which we have taken into account during our analysis. So the main like objective of this case study is to provide like answers to the following question. So distance and time for migration of dissolve phase to receptor under current scenario. So under the current scenario, like what is the risk of like dissolve phase migration to the surface body? Also, like how long the receptor is protected with no active remedy. And sorry that before I proceed here, I forgot to mention the focus area. So our main primary focus area is in interaction so between the source boundary, that is like slurry wall boundary, and east to the boundary wall, where there is no any active remedy system. So on the focus area, like that is a interface between the slurry wall boundary and east from the slurry wall boundary, where there is no active like any remedy system. So that is the potential like focus area or like study area, which has the potential risks of dissolve phase and NAPL phase migration to the surface body. So now, using this tool, like we are trying to answer like, okay, how effective is the current like pump and treat system, or like what are the different operational like scenarios we can operate in order to contain the risks. So here you can also see like when the system is operating, like based on the contour maps, we can see the inward gradient is kind of maintained, and the inward gradient kind of extends a little bit further from the slurry wall boundary, but there is no any kind of capture when it passes that zone. So that means like on the focus area, there is no any capture. So that is always a risk area. Also, like we are trying to see if there is any alternative remedy that can manage the risks for different conditions. And also, like, we are trying to see, like, based on these questions, like, are we able to answer, like, if we have enough, like, data to analyze the risks. So these are the very basic, like, input parameters we kind of, like, focused on. The RC flux, that is a function of conductivity, site-specific input parameters, hydraulic gradient, and source area plume. Retardation coefficient, that is also a site-specific parameter, decay rate, and dispersivity. So there are, like, few basic like assumptions. So the flow is assumed to be one directional, isotropic, and homogeneous media. So since this is a legacy site, like, based on our, like, data that we have available, like, we kind of approximated the source area for both dissolved and NAPL phase data, and also the decay rate was considered to be phosphorus decay rate. And for evaluation scenarios, like, since this is a perimeter system and the hydrogeological condition is largely impacted by the fluctuation between groundwater and surface water body, that affects, like, overall your Darcy flux, and also, like, current pump and system operations. So different scenarios for operating or extraction rate, like, how does it impact overall, like, capture zone. And also, like, based on the data we have, like, we were also trying to see, like, plume attenuation and decay characteristics scenarios. So now I'm gonna briefly talk about, like, what did we learn, or what was the preliminary result from our case study. So first, here we use the Power BI front end to show the visual map, and this is based on the current condition. So here you can see, like, this black dot is the leading edge of apparent source, and the red dot is the distance of plume front at concentrations greater than 120 microgram per liter. So we, for the dissolved phase, like, we kind of look for benzene, like, rigs. So basically, like, here you can see the distance from the leading edge of apparent source is 15 meters. So we are trying to see, like, the number of days it takes to travel this dissolved phase plume to migrate from initial source all the way to the receptor. So now for the first scenario, like, we kind of took the current condition as I mentioned previously. So we took the gradient value of 0.005, and here you can see for 61 days, like, the plume migration is not significant. But here you can see on 91 days, the plume started migrating towards the receptor. If you see here, like, so almost like 200 days, the plume reaches the receptor. So that is the maximum time the system can be turned off, like, either for maintenance or that is the maximum time it is a risk-free when the system is not operating. And we also kind of looked, like, a couple of other, like, iterations to see, like, what would be the impact of gradient when there is a 50% decrease in gradient for the NAPL migration. So for that, like, the gradient value is 0.0025. Here you can see, like, for 61 days, like, there was no any movement, and then it started initial movement for 91 days, and all the way, like, here you can see almost like 600 days, you can see the plume reaching the receptor. So if you compare from the current scenario, like, where it was like 200 days to reach the plume to the receptor, here, like, when the gradient is decreased by 50%, almost like 3 times the days, like, the system can be turned off, or, like, there is no risk for, like, 600 days. So that is three times the current scenario. Similarly, like, we also wanted to see, like, what would be the migration when there's an increase in 50% gradient value. So here you can see, like, for 61 days, the plume started already migrating, and then, like, almost like 122 days, like, the plume reaches the surface water body. So based on these 3 scenarios, like, we can say, like, how good this tool is in terms of, like, visualizing, or in terms of providing the context of, like, risk to receptor migration, or, like, potential, how can you visualize, or how can you use the current data from your site-specific data to evaluate the risks to your system, and then, like, based on that, you can plan either, like, your alternative remedies, or you can plan, like, okay, this is the time frame the system can be turned off without any risks, and these are the important parameters that I need to kind of focus more into refining the model. And here I'm going to briefly talk about like the sensitivity analysis. So here you can see on the left, on x-axis, like you have normalized range value for different input parameters, that is dispersivity, conductivity, source concentration, decay rate, and FOC. And on y-axis, like you can see the number of days it reaches to that threshold concentration of benzene, that is 120 microgram per liter. So it is a surface water criteria for that surface water where our case study is located. So basically, the key takeaway from this like left graph is that like here you can see the conductivity and decay rate is your like Plume migration matrix. So here you can see like when there is a increase in conductivity and decay rate, the number of days it takes to reach that threshold value of 120 microgram, that is the benzene concentration, is significantly reduced. And here you can see the 0.2 is kind of like inflation rate. After that, below that point, like the change in slope for these different input parameters is minimal. Similarly, for decay rate and FOC, also like we can see those are also the combined like depletion metrics that has a key role in terms of like these are also the key kind of like parameters that is like really sensitive in terms of like degradation or biodegradation. So on the right hand side you can see the maximum sensitive parameter is hydraulic conductivity and dispersivity, as I previously mentioned, and also like decay rate and FOC combined like depletion matrix, that is decay rate and FOC, are also significantly sensitive. So now I would like to ask Ranga to go over to the NAPL evaluation. Oh, okay. Okay, so before we move into there, like, so what did we learn from the dissolve phase case study? So as I previously mentioned, like, so we were trying to answer the following questions. So distance and time for migration for dissolve phase to receptor under current scenario. Like based on the current scenario, we saw that like it was almost like 200 days it takes the RIX to reach the receptor, and how long the receptor will be protected with active remedy. So with the current condition and with the active remedy ongoing, the system has some influence on the western edge of focus area, that is the green circle, and that day is like 200 days. Also, like, is MNA alone adequate? So, yeah, there is some kind of like biodegradation or going on there, but still we need to further validate that result. And how does the system need to operate? So, as I previously mentioned, like we kind of did multiple iteration in terms of operating that pump and treat or like dewatering systems. So based on that, like increased flow from the solvent section kind of increase the capture to the boundary edge, but it is not adequate in order to capture overall like focus area. And is there any alternative remedy that can manage the RIX for all conditions? As example like bi-sparging or bi-venting that kind of destroys the drivers. Those are other like alternative remedies that can be used in order to manage the RIX in this focus area. And also like, do I have all data that address the RIX? So as I previously showed you the sensitivity analysis, so based on the sensitivity analysis, we saw that like Darcy flux was most sensitive and decay rate and dispersivity are kind of a little less sensitive compared to Darcy flux, but still that needs validation. So once we have a fair sort idea of like sensitive parameters and level of confidence for the existing site-specific data that we have, that allows us to kind of like plan or prioritize our like data collection in order to refine the model, in order to refine the existing data we have in terms of like, okay, so what are the main input parameters that we need to collect, and also like how long, what is the frequency of data collection, so that it will represent actual like site condition, and it will help us to manage the RIX in a longer term. So now I will ask Ranga to go through the NAPL.
Thank you, Saroj. I hope that was insightful as far as how this tool is being used from a dissolve phase point of view. I'm going to kind of quickly discuss the NAPL phase. So I guess the conditions haven't changed except that you're seeing a conceptual, I wouldn't say conceptual, you're actually seeing the extent of the NAPL body itself based on fluid level data in terms of, what the overall extent or the footprint of NAPL is in this area. So the focus again is going to be the same, meaning this our focus is going to be this particular area here. And so I'm going to kind of also, the conditions haven't changed necessarily. We are essentially answering the same questions. What is the distance and time for migration of the NAPL body itself? How long is the receptor protected with no active remedy? Does NSCD have a role to play here? And how do the system needs to operate? Do we have the data and so on and so forth? Okay. So what are the input parameters? So the input parameters are mainly, you need to know something about the flux itself. When we talk about flux, we're talking about the flux because of migration of the body and the flux associated with the natural losses. What is the NAPL gradient? The physical properties, mainly the density, the cross-sectional area, and the media parameters, right? So those are the key input parameters that we are going to be needing. Because essentially, as I said, we are talking about relating the migration to the depletion, right? So these are the key parameters that we need to know before we proceed with the NAPL analysis. Assumptions, same as before. Just two specific assumptions that are associated with the NAPL phase itself is that the NSCD rate, we do have site-specific data, but the assumption is that the actual rate is only 50% from the mobile phase, meaning that, you have a certain rate. You also have NAPL being degraded, the source is being degraded both from the residual phase and the mobile phase. And because we are talking about Plume migration, the expectation, we are only looking at the mobile phase. So, and we're saying that 50% is a reasonable approximation based on the body of knowledge we have to say that the NSCD rate is 50% from the mobile phase. The NAPL gradient itself is going to be different because the head of the NAPL and the way, because of the density changes and the capillary pressure changes, your gradient is going to be changed and the related permeability, right? But the point is we are approximating the NAPL gradient to be the same as the hydraulic gradient. And the evaluation scenarios is the same as the dissolve phase because the system the pump and treat system was designed to, control the dissolve phase and recover the NAPL phase. All right. So let me quickly jump through and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I'm just going to kind of emphasize on the highlighted sections itself. So we did both the oblong and the linear approximation that Saroj alluded to in the theory. So we started off with both the approximations, but we said the oblong is more of accurate because one thing I want to emphasize, and Saroj mentioned it, is the understanding the site conceptual model is very, very important whenever we're getting into this evaluation. So it doesn't hurt to do multiple iterations or approximations, but at the end of the day, you need to really understand what your conceptual model tells you. So we started off with the approximate solution wherein we know at long times you're going to essentially get somewhat a linear relationship between the migration and the depletion. But bear in mind is that the linear approximation assumes that your NAPL flux is uniform across your mobile NAPL interval, which is typically not the case, knowing how the NAPL behaves, unless, if your mobile NAPL interval is relatively small enough compared to the changes in the gradient, then maybe perhaps, but, and obviously your soil parameters are also going to play a role. But for the most part, your linear approximation is perhaps more conservative or overly conservative. So, when we kind of use site-specific parameters like the oblong, your distance ranges anywhere from 100 to 400 feet. But for argument's sake, we are saying that, yes, the plume is going to migrate because we are looking at a receptor that's approximately about 40 feet away, 45 feet away. But, yes, it's going to migrate to the receptor. It's going to impact the receptor. But the question is, how long is it going to take, which I'll get to in a minute. Because these are time approximations, meaning like we're assuming this is the long time. Basically, you're essentially neglecting the time case here. And so you're saying that at infinite time or a long time period, your plume is actually going to hit the receptor. So at what are the parameters that we can change or influence is the PN and perhaps the natural losses, right, the flux. So if our PN reduces to 0.2, right, then we are actually saying that you're going to be hitting the receptor or you're going to be, at least 0.2 or below 0.2, then you're kind of protected from a migration point of view, assuming your natural losses are the same, which is kind of falls under the ITRC range of 0.1 to 0.8, right? for hydraulically recoverable NAPL, right? And it's on the lower end, which makes sense based on the site conceptual model that we know of. For Q itself, assuming your TN is not changing, it's still at like the 1.2 square feet per day, your Q basically has to increase by an order of magnitude. It has to go from 6.6 times 10 power minus 6 to 8 times 10 power minus 5 for you to be able to be protected, for the receptor to be protected. Okay, so knowing what we know, what we did was we took it to the next level and see what does a plume kind of look like. This is like a concept. I mean, the numbers are true, but the shaded area just kind of gives you a visual of what the plume body looks like, right? We are looking at an elliptical shape, and we are primarily focused on the central line of the plume, so this edge itself. So you're looking at two different iterations wherein, you know, at a time period of about 0.1 years, my plume body is about little less than 5 feet from the source zone, from the apparent source area, or the leading edge of that source area. And after 5 years, it's going to be a little over 20 feet. I think it's about 25 or 20, yeah, about 20 feet or so. So this gives you what is my plume length, what is it going to look like. The graph at the bottom tells you where is my plume located. Like, for example, you're looking at a plot of time on the x-axis and the actual location of the leading edge of the plume. So the 0 is the central line of the plume, which is this, and then you're assuming it to be a uniform body. It's just like a symmetrical body. And so as you can see that, you know, at 1 year, the plume is about a little over 10 feet, and at 5 years, it's a little over 26 feet. So you're able to also kind of literally track. It's like a particle tracking, right? So you're able to actually track where the leading edge of the plume is. So this kind of gives you a context, a visual context on where it is. So we also did a similar approach in Power BI. So I'm just going to run through a series of iterations. The starting point is still the same. We are looking at the same starting location. And so at time 0, this is where my plume is at a certain concentration. And then at a period of about 127 days, which is like little less than half a year, this is where it is, which is shown by the red dot. At a little over a year, it's located about 12 feet away. 2 years, it's about 17 feet. About 20 feet after a little over 3 years, and by the end of like the 5-year period, the plume is about 26 feet away. So you're able to literally, you know, just like Saroj showed for the dissolve phase, you're able to, say that, you know, if my conditions don't change, if my transmissivity stays the same, my natural loss stays the same, my conditions do not change significantly, I can say that my plume, there is a risk of my plume migrating or at least getting close to the receptor in 26 years. So to give you some context, that 112 feet that I showed you, right, in the long time approximation, it's about a little over 100 years, I think 150 or 200 years before the plume actually reaches the receptor. But again, as you can see, it kind of slows down, and this is where my plume is going to be at the end of the 5-year period, just to kind of give you a visual context. Okay, what else? So we understand these are the parameters we need, the migration and the depletion metrics. But what plays a larger role in terms of sensitivity? What has a larger impact on the plume, on the actual risk itself, right? So I did a very I actually took the data but normalized it to see what is my sensitivity look like. So on the x-axis, you're looking at the % reduction in transmissivity or NSCD rate, meaning that if I decreased or increased my transmissivity or NSCD rate by a certain factor, then what does it do to the plume distance, right? So it's kind of opposite, right? Because if your transmissivity increases, it's in the numerator, so obviously your risk is higher, right? Because your plume is going to get to the receptor much faster. If your NSCD rate increases, it's the opposite effect, right? Because you're depleting the plume for a certain migration rate, for a certain flux. So obviously its effect is going to be different. So the graph that you're seeing is essentially the orange line is your NSCD rate, the blue line is your transmissivity rate. So if your transmissivity decreases by 50% from where it was, like from 1.2, it went down to about 0.6, your net change in distance is only about 31%, right? And if it goes to 75%, it's 56%, and if it's 10% of the value, like 90% decrease, then basically you're saying that it's going to go down up to 80%, right? Whereas if you look at the NSCD rate, you're looking at a much larger change. Like if your NSCD rate actually doubles, you're looking at a 46% increase in your Q, in your overall reduction in the distance. And you're looking at, when it goes to 75%, right, 78% higher, then it's about 108, and then when it is pretty much, almost double that, then you're looking at about 200%. So this goes to show that the influence or the effect of natural source zone depletion, the natural attenuation processes, have a much larger role to play or much more effective in mitigating the risk than the transmissivity itself, because the transmissivity is more of a migration metric, right? Migration and a recoverability metric, which goes to show that, yes, the existing system does have a role to play, but, we are probably better off in enhancing the natural processes here, which goes back to the, the summary here as to, what did we learn from this evaluation of the NAPL phase is concerned. So we are saying that it's going to take about 200 years or so for the plume to migrate 116 feet, which is a long time, but the risk is certainly there. And how long is the receptor protected with no active remedy? So, yeah, we have the pump and treat system. We have the body here. It's kind of in the boundary. So when the system is actually operating a certain way, that we know that there is inward gradient, so we don't see any of this thing. But however, this does not extend to the area outside the barriers, right, outside the anthropogenic remedies we have. So if you're kind of extrapolating it a little and saying that if my plume or if my point or leading edge of the plume is here, then obviously it's not going to be influenced by the system. So then the focus is on what is my long-term remedy, right? So which goes back to the third and the fourth points, which is like, is NSED alone adequate? I think it is, perhaps, but it certainly needs validation, because the NSED, what it does is it depletes your risk, right? So, and it also takes care of your driver. So obviously it is a critical plume mitigation mechanism, but it obviously needs further validation. The system needs to operate. We touched upon it. The one thing we can say is that while we are kind of investing or, strategizing on what our long-term remedy is, the system does have a role to play. And perhaps even transmissivity could be a metric, because if you're able to kind of look at the transmissivity itself, the trends in the transmissivity, we are able to target and perhaps do some recovery, so that if you're able to reduce the net saturation, the mobile saturation in the subsurface, you are able to mitigate the risk while we are kind of focused on the long-term remedy. Okay, so what are the key takeaways from this? So the key takeaways, NSED rate is important. It's a potentially viable remedy. Obviously, the challenge is it's still an evolving science in terms of, is there an easier way to get this information? And we have to bear in mind that NSED rate is not as simple as collecting fluids data or doing bail-down testing for transmissivity, right? Relatively speaking. Obviously, there are different tools and techniques like traps, gradient methods, and then the thermal methods, which is a more recent metric that is still evolving, but this is the wild card. So we really need to understand, it goes back to defining and refining our conceptual site model. So we need to really understand that. And NSED rates can change with seasons and timing. But what the key takeaway is that NSED rate has a role to play, and perhaps our focus is to maybe not collect NSED data, but at least we may still want to collect the baseline NSED data. But what this evaluation tells you is that maybe we have to look at remedies that are enhancing the NSED rates, like biosparging, bioventing, and things like that. Hydrogeologic conditions affect the transmissivity, which we already know about. But is it practical to collect, do TN testing at multiple locations all the time? Or if you have a recovery system or a set of recovery systems, we can estimate transmissivities based on decline curves. But this also is a way to optimize how we are doing recovery, right? We just don't want to, endlessly keep on pumping, assuming that, you draw down the fluids great enough that you expose the NAPL and you're pumping, because that's not the case. You're essentially going to be smearing more so than not. So it is very important to kind of understand your source area, your plume dimensions, understand where your mobile NAPL interval is. So which is the combination of, you need to do diagnostic gauge plots, you need to look at your NAPL maps, your footprint maps. Perhaps do targeted LNAPL modeling, like the LDRM is a tool to do that, to really understand what is the risk or where is your LNAPL body, or what is the migration mechanism or the migration risk is for your body itself. All right, finally, key takeaways. So to kind of wrap it up, we do have some excellent information from this. We are able to better understand how the migration and depletion work in tandem, and which play a larger role. What are the metrics, individual metrics that have a larger influence in terms of sensitivity? So there are a couple of key takeaways. First off, it's very important we understand the Plume characteristics, which goes back to the whole conceptual site model, right? We really need to understand, okay, this is my risk point, and then this is my receptor, or this is my point of compliance or point of exposure, however we want to define it, and understand what does it mean, right? So do we have a good understanding of the parameters? It is also about sensitivity analysis versus confidence, right, in the data that we have. So this evaluation does indicate that your Darcy flux parameters are the most sensitive. Decay rates and dispersivity are sensitive or less sensitive, which means like we don't need to spend a whole lot of effort from a field point of view in terms of data collection. Maybe it's more important to actually understand what the gradient patterns are, how does the surface water and groundwater interact, and how does it impact the system, the way the system is operating, and things like that. From a NAPL point of view, I mean, M&A is a critical risk mitigator, which we have already seen it. But it's also important to know that because it's relatively less sensitive, are we okay with saying maybe instead of a decay rate, are we okay with a bulk attenuation rate? If we have some analytical data, right, you could do a data like you could plot a concentration versus distance and perhaps determine a bulk attenuation rate, and that may suffice. That may act as a surrogate for your decay rate. So that's one thing. The NSCD is a critical parameter, which I said. So obviously we may want to have some level of baseline NSCD data, but beyond that, from a sensitivity point of view, we know that that is a critical parameter. So perhaps the focus is more on the remedy rather than going and collecting more data associated with NSCD rates, right? Transmissivity is less sensitive compared to NSCD, but it is a useful and sensitive parameter. So we can be very strategic in how we are collecting transmissivity data. There are also alternate techniques to measure transmissivity. There is recent research that indicates you could actually use fluid level data to estimate transmissivity, which is something that we are actually doing right now as part of expanding this proof of concept. Allows for a strategic data collection. We have seen that this is an agnostic platform because we have been experimenting it with Excel and R and with a Power BI environment. This can be also exported into a GIS-based interface like ArcGIS and things like that, where, at the end of the day, we are able to see a point in time as far as the risk is concerned, right? It all boils down to that. In fact, it is even stakeholder agnostic, so people are able to visually understand what is the risk associated with my Plume. So the key questions that we need to answer or we need to take away from this is, how confident are we with our existing data set, which this tool allows us to answer? And it goes to the strategic data collection aspect of it. What is the sensitivity analysis telling us? So we did the sensitivity analysis, and perhaps we kind of maybe collect some additional data, and we could look at additional sensitivity techniques, like perhaps bootstrapping to determine what is actually the real sensitivity versus the confidence intervals. Have we captured all viable scenarios? That is very important because we're talking about the existing situations. Like as we get into seasonal variations or climate extremes, right? This tool allows us to model it because once we have the data, it is just a simple matter of almost like plug in and getting in the results. So that's the three takeaways. So to conclude, I hope this tool has been very useful for all of you. I mean, in terms of the proof of concept that we presented. But what we can confidently say is that this is a true normalized risk metric because that relates to the migration and to the depletion, and it's a distance-based metric. It is a scalable tool, which we showed with the examples. It provides an excellent framework for remedy action objectives. It allows for optimizing existing systems too. So as to my point, transmissivity is a good way to understand it. Like we are able to strategically start recovering NAPL based on the hydrogeologic conditions so that we are essentially reducing the transmissivity while we are focused more on the long-term remedy. This is also technology agnostic in the sense that this can work in Excel, it can work in R or any other things, and it's easy to understand by the stakeholders because we are looking at a map wherein we are showing the location or the point where we have the risk at any given time. With that being said, last but not the least, I would really like to acknowledge my colleagues, Jim Schutz and his team Kyla Watt and Melanie Beck, who have provided extensive support as far as Power BI, R, and even Excel is concerned, and also with the sensitivity analysis. So with that being said, I would like to really thank you all for attending, and hopefully this has been a good and useful information for you all. So with that being said, I'm open for question and answers. Thank you.
All right. Ranga, Saroj, thank you both for the presentation. It's fascinating, and I get the impression that you guys could go on a lot longer with the enthusiasm you have over this topic. So appreciate that. We will open it up for Q&A now, and Stephanie will give you some directions here.
Thank you. So your question and answer session will now begin. If you wish to ask a question, please key *1 on your telephone, record your name, and then press the pound key, making sure that your telephone is not muted. If you then decide to withdraw your question, simply key *2, and all questions will be answered in the order received. Alternatively, you may submit a question on the WebEx, click on the Q&A tab, type in your question, and click Send to all panelists. So just to remind you, if you wish to ask an audio question, key *1 on your telephone, record your name, and then press the pound key, making sure your telephone is not muted. Or on the WebEx, to do this, click on the Q&A tab, type in your question, and click Send to all panelists.
I'm going to kick this off with a little question here, Ranga. You mentioned in your conclusions that this is scalable, and I know that you're working on one of the larger projects that we have in the portfolio. It's an active refinery. What is the other end of the spectrum? How small of a site would this be appropriate for implementing?
Thanks, Scott. That's a good question. In my opinion, I think this can actually be even applicable to retail gas stations. We are looking at monitoring well, perhaps within the the forecourt area where you may typically have underground storage tanks, all the way to the retail gas station boundary too. So if assuming those are impacted too, there is no I don't see any limitations as far as even using it for those kinds of sites.
And with regard to it being easy to understand by stakeholders, have you had an opportunity to present this to either a regulator or to another stakeholder or a third-party property owner or something like that?
No, Scott. So this is more of, not to segue from the question. So as seen from the picture, right, we're taking baby steps and an agile approach here. But it's more of the proof of concept to make sure that we are on the right track, right? Because in some sense, we're kind of working our way backwards. Because once you understand the migration to the depletion, this allows us to really kind of hone down on the data, on the methodology, and things like that. So to answer your question, no, we have not presented it. We're kind of actively working with the client to kind of scale it up and make it more robust.
Okay, we have no audio questions.
Everybody, just another minute here in case you have an opportunity right now to ask a question. You can either type it in or key it in. And while we're giving everybody another minute here, can you go one more slide?
Sure. Oh, the last one?
Yes. So our next presentation is going to be on energy and climate resilience for the environmental remediation. It's going to be presented by Kat Sheen, who is a PE with Parsons, and Jessica Bennett, who is another PE working with Kat. So that will be March 17th. We'll have an announcement that will come out prior to that. So I hope everybody can join us for that presentation as well. One last chance. Stephanie, do we have any other questions?
There are no questions.
All right. Then I want to thank Saroj and Ranga for your presentation and the time you took putting this together. And I also want to thank everybody out there who took the time to share this hour with us and to join us for this presentation. Hope to see you all again next month. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes your conference call for today. You may now disconnect. Thank you for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.